Hi, welcome to Hudson Institute Political Studies. My name is Emily Bowling, and I'm a 2022 alumnus of the program. I've been living and working in DC since, but prior to the program, I attended Clemson University, where I studied political science. I'll be leaving DC this fall to begin my Ph.D. at Boston College in political theory. Today, I'm joined by Professor Murray Dry, who is the Charles A. Dana Professor of Political Science at Middlebury College, where he teaches courses in political philosophy, American political thought, and American constitutional law. He is the author of Same-Sex Marriage and American Constitutionalism, Civil Peace and the Quest for Truth, and numerous articles and book chapters on the various topics concerning American constitutionalism, especially the American founding. He also saw Herbert Storing's The Complete Anti-Federalist through the press and made selections for one volume edition of that 7-volume work. Professor Dry has held visiting professorships at Harvard University, Yeshiva University, and Santa Clara University. He has also been a liberal arts fellow at Harvard Law School and a visiting scholar at Stanford Law School and NYU Law School. He received his AB, MA, and PhD from the University of Chicago. So thank you, Professor Dry, for joining us today.
I'm honored, Emily, and in the spirit of Hudson Institute's support for this Great Books program, which I think is wonderful, I want to add something else to my resume. My first leave of absence took me to Washington, where I was a congressional fellow and served in the office of Lee Hamilton, a moderate Democrat from Indiana, a wonderful congressman. I wish there were more like Hamilton and like Michael Gallagher, whom we heard earlier this week. That's been my one foray as an adult outside of the ivory tower, as it's called. And it was very valuable. I think it complemented my study of American politics by having the chance to participate in a congressional office and observe it from the inside.
I'm sure. So in many ways, returning here for the summer is sort of a homecoming for you, albeit a brief homecoming.
I have warm memories of the year that we lived, my wife and I lived in Washington, and an appreciation of the intensity of federal government for everybody living in the district.
Sure.
Yes, I do.
There's also a bit of an intense character that people that live here tend to possess. They're very professional at all times. But. Well, thank you for joining us. I was hoping to ask you a couple questions about this week. This week, students studied the American refounding. So they took a pretty close look at Lincoln's politics and American politics in the time of Lincoln more generally. But this week doesn't necessarily start with readings from that time period. Instead, you start with some readings from the Republic, which are interwoven throughout the rest of the summer coursework. I'm wondering if you could maybe give us a brief idea, or give me particularly a brief idea of what students studied this week. I know there's a particular look at the ranking of regimes and maybe what these studies have to do with the rest of the week in the American refounding.
So how does one explain starting a week on the American refounding with books 8 and 9 of Plato's Republic, which is what we did? Well, as Rachel Mackey points out in the introductions to each week, the first week starts with political philosophy and the issues of founding. And in addition to reading, I think in the first week, it's just maybe the first book of the Republic, they read all of Machiavelli's Prince. So the idea there, I think, is to present two different accounts of the best regime, which are really accompanied by two different accounts of the best life. Week 2 starts with the American founding. Yeah. So there, students read Tocqueville on the American Constitution, democracy in America, and they read some Federalists, Jefferson, which is here. Tocqueville and Jefferson are here. Somehow the Federalists didn't make it. And they read some of the Anti-Federalists from the selection of Storing's collection that I did. In week 3, the students continue their study of Plato's Republic. So by the end of the first 3 weeks, students have first of all read much of Plato's Republic, all of Machiavelli's Prince, and at least substantial documents related to the American founding. So you could say they're getting an account of two different notions of the best regime, and implicit, at least in Plato and Machiavelli, is the notion of the best life And with America, there's maybe the suggestion that it's somewhere between, or there's the question, where does it fit? So when we get to the fourth week, which is identified primarily with Lincoln and the crisis that leads to the Civil War, the issue is refounding, or as Lincoln puts it, can a republic maintain itself without either breaking up or becoming a tyranny? Books 8 and 9 in the Republic involve the declining regimes, or the imperfect regimes, from the closest to the best to the worst, focusing on the notion that the more desires get in the way of rational activity, the weaker the regime. So the order is honor-loving, money-loving, freedom-loving, democracy, tyranny. When I teach it, and maybe also for students here, it's a little bit of a shock to find out democracy ranks fourth. One of the things that I like to highlight, and I did this past Monday, was that when Socrates talks about these different regimes in man, the human being, it turns out he's drawing on the variety of regimes that are in the democratic political regime in order to find the different individual types. Which means not only is democracy not a bad place to go to find the different types, but it really means it's not a bad place for philosophers. And if it turns out we reflect on the fact that the combination of the communism of women and children and scientific breeding, which has never been proven to be possible, and the exclusion of everyone over the age of 10, those by themselves suggest that Socrates is serious about this best regime. Well, that means from the point of, if philosophy is the best life, all of a sudden the democratic regime is looking a lot better than it did initially. So that's just very interesting to think about. The analogy is presented ostensibly to make it easier to find justice, as larger letters are easier to find than smaller letters. At that point, I indicated to my students that in recent years I've converted the font size, which is, the standard is 12 to 14. It's a little, pretty soon I may have to go to 16. Some of the students responded by sending me their papers at 14. It turns out that what's instructive about the analogy is its imperfection. You know, that there's a difference between regime understood in a political sense, a body politic, and different types of human beings. Yeah. And we did then finally, I think it took until Tuesday for me to get to the nature of the tyrant, having the sting of longing put in the tyrant. And Socrates uses an image of the drones, bees that don't do any public service. They're either beggars or they are wrongdoers. That private class of individuals, beggars or wrongdoers, comes up in the oligarchy and persists in the democracy. And that is the source of the transition from the democracy to the tyranny. We might say today it starts with some version of a populist democracy. There are examples of this threat today, so that Socrates' discussion of these different regimes, I think, illustrates that we can see counterparts today. Certainly the most common regimes are some version of democracy or oligarchy, and maybe a mixture. And we see that this transition from a certain kind of democracy that overemphasizes freedom could lead to some form of tyranny. Today, that's called a threat from populist democracy. And it's present in a number of current democracies. So that's a preparation for a consideration of what is not so much a decline, it's not treated as a decline in the American regime, but a specific challenge. Yeah. And the reading starts with Lincoln's Lyceum address called The Perpetuation of Our Political Institutions. The Lyceum address is known in part for his emphasis on the need to counteract mob rule by developing a reverence for the laws as a political religion. But he also introduces the question, as he puts it later, can republics maintain themselves by raising the problem of ambition. Now that's very interesting because in the second week of the program, the students read Federalist 70 to 72, in which Hamilton defends the re-eligibility of the executive, as well as the unity. Now it turns out, now this is an aside, okay, that if one looked at the Federal Convention, one would see that when the unity was first proposed, Madison, who was taking all these notes, had enough time to write a considerable pause ensuing. And I did get a student to explain. I said, well, so why? My gosh, it smacks of monarchy. They just finished separating themselves from a monarch. And Edmund Randolph, the governor of Virginia, Madison wrote them, Randolph introduced them, he called this the fetus of monarchy. In other words, you read the Federalist on the executive, it's very persuasive, the need for unity. And that was not a major criticism of the Anti-Federalists. I think that's because everybody knew who the first president was going to be. It's hard to imagine we would have had the office of the president without the framers knowing who the first president was going to be. Lincoln does a very interesting thing in the second half of that speech. First of all, the beginning of it introduces the relationship between founding and maintaining with the clear implication our job only is to preserve, that maintaining is easier than founding. But when he gets to a discussion of ambition, all of a sudden it gets flipped. For a reason that one might say, oh, this is a youthful Lincoln who hasn't yet matured, but may in fact have something to it. In other words, he's taking ambition, which Hamilton no less, someone who's for strong government, thought the Constitution had adequately dealt with by providing not only for this office, but for the possibility of being rewarded with re-eligibility if you do well. Lincoln talks about the towering genius who disdains a beaten path, okay? A Caesar, a Napoleon. Lincoln says, the truly ambitious man won't be satisfied just fulfilling an office in a government established by others. And he goes so far as to say the towering genius, he'll achieve his objective, or at least try to, so to speak, by hook or by crook. And what he means by that, his example is, either by freeing the slaves or enslaving all free men. Now that's very interesting, and I had a student right away say, read it as Lincoln thinking himself into his position. And a noted a literary critic saw it that way. So you could say, looking forward, as we move from 1838 in this speech to the Peoria speech in 1854 and the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858, and then what Lincoln did as president, one might say, did Lincoln do everything he did in order to, and if you think about it, he didn't only become president, but if you go back to that speech, who among all Americans, if anyone, rivals George Washington as the most admired? Answer: Lincoln. Right. Was that his objective, or was that something that just incidentally happened? It seems to me, based on the first inaugural, that he wanted to preserve the Union, and he thought the best way to do it, and to keep slavery in course of ultimate extinction, was to avoid a civil war, not go into it, so that he could become the great emancipator, and as later on have us read about him and regard him as at least the equal to Washington, if not. So the week that I just finished teaching on the question of refounding starts with an account from Plato, which does introduce the problem of maintaining democracy, albeit again, Plato's Socrates is describing what we would call today, to make it clear, direct democracy, but even representative democracy, and Tocqueville makes this clear in various places, is open to the possibility of centralizing power too much, and maybe in the wrong person. Well, to get back to the program, the question of refounding turns on not necessarily a towering genius in the form of a Napoleon, but because it's more a matter of the slavery controversy coming to a head.
Right.
Okay? And what we find in Lincoln's Peoria speech in 1854, when he comes back into national politics with this new Republican Party, that in his view, public sentiment is moving in the wrong direction. It's moving towards support for Stephen Douglas's view that the people in the territory should decide whether or not to have slavery. And from Lincoln's perspective, what happens in the territories eventually is going to involve the entire country. That's what he means by saying a house divided against itself cannot stand. He would have been willing to patiently wait anything to avoid a civil war, because you don't know what's going to happen, and look for opportunities that compensated emancipation. And also he was recommending colonization. That's an interesting topic, okay? We take for granted the overall virtues of diversity. Tocqueville writes about America. First, democracy is in America. Then he says, now I'm going to talk about something that's distinctively American, and that's the three races and their relationships. And he, interestingly, someone who is so prescient, he thought there'd be a race war in the South, and the North would say, good riddance. And what I like to say, and it's overly dramatic, it's fair, the one thing that Tocqueville did not foresee was a Lincoln. Of course, it's more than just Lincoln. Lincoln had to succeed, and he had to have some help in arresting the opinion that Stephen Douglas was supporting, that this question of slavery is like any other political question, let the majority decide it. I should probably stop it. I mean, in other words, that's where we got in week 4. Let me then somehow reflect on what that means. This is an extremely ambitious program. I think the first 4 weeks have a certain unity to them. After all, in week 5, it becomes public policy. Week 6 is a kind of conclusion where the students get to complete the Republic with Book 10 and the Myth of and they read some portions of the Bible, which is an important source of American education, certainly Lincoln's, and they read a Shakespeare play. So it's identified in terms of things external to politics. The first 4 weeks are an attempt to introduce students to different views on the relationship between thought and action, philosophy and politics, and then to see how those different views apply or are illustrated in America, both at the time of the founding and at the time of the greatest challenge to the regime, which Lincoln formulated in terms of, must the republic be too strong for the freedom of its peoples or too weak to maintain itself?
Interesting. I'm struck by your discussion of Lincoln's ambition in particular, and I think it is one of the relationships between politics and the good life that we're presented is sort of the virtue of honorable ambition that I think is really honed in on this week. I mean, I read a lot of the stuff in my undergraduate degree, but there was a certain tone about honorable ambition that was distinctly different than what we see here. And I think what you offered about Lincoln actually pretty concisely summarizes that.
Just if I could interrupt you, how would you describe this understanding of ambition that you received in your undergraduate education?
Well, we were discussing previously, my undergraduate program had a particular economic twist about it, so oftentimes this idea of honorable ambition was tied up sort of in something like the virtue of selfishness.
So Tocqueville's self-interest well understood? That...
Sort of. It ended up with a little bit more of an objectivist sort of turn.
And what does that mean?
I would say, to put it shortly, it stripped the honor from the ambition in many ways. Rather than aiming to help others or lead others to a better life.
So it's a critical view, an unqualifiedly critical view of ambition? Is that what you said? Would you say? Is that what you received?
Sort of, actually, yes, I think so. And more turned inward than outward. More directed at one's own success than maybe the well-being or happiness.
Now that's a very interesting theme in Tocqueville. And it comes out in a chapter that I think is hard to understand, and I came back to it to make sure I explained it as well as I could. And that's when he talks about a tension between equality and freedom.
Right.
And he really describes equality as a condition. He's writing from the perspective that the Americans give us an example of what it's like to have enjoyed the benefits of a revolution without having had to undergo it. Now that's a strange thing. First of all, wait a minute, Tocqueville, what about the American Revolution? And he knows all about that. He's talking about a social change whereby laws that establish stratified classes, laws of entail and primogeniture. The land is connected to families, and it passes from one generation to the other, and it can't be divided, and so just, all right, it passes then from father to son. Second son, if there's something, the first son dies, and I suppose it can pass to the daughter if there are no sons. Now, you get rid of those laws, and then all of a sudden you have more of an equality of distribution of wealth. And that affects what Tocqueville calls the mores, the habits, the customs, the expectations. That establishes a condition of equality. And while the two can go together and can produce more freedom, Tocqueville certainly points out you can have freedom in aristocracy. It's more extensive in democracy. But as he describes it, equality is the most powerful element in this democratic social state. Incidentally, or in contrast to Plato and Aristotle, talk about different regimes based on number and object. Tocqueville is talking about societies, a social condition. One that's hierarchical and the other that's egalitarian or collegial. And his main purpose, in a way, in writing this is to write to his fellow Frenchmen, French citizens, and to say, one, there's no way to go back. Two, religion can be helpful. And three, beware of the possibility of loving equality so much that for the sake of having equality secured, you give up your freedom. I mean, he's clearly thinking about Napoleon, all right? That you can have a great deal of equality with very little, if any, political freedom. And as he puts it, political freedom requires effort, and it's also the case that it's going to be elitist. Not everyone can hold office. Okay. Now, what I did today, I think it was today to come back to it, was to introduce something that Aristotle makes explicit. It's implicit in the analogy between the city and man in the Republic. And that's freedom can be viewed in one of two ways. Yeah. One is rule by we the people or whatever body, ruling and being ruled. But the other is, and it's probably more common to Americans, and maybe your Clemson program, because you indicated an inclination towards capitalism, favored this. The other view of freedom is the individual freedom to do what you want. Right? Those two can be in tension. Tocqueville's concern about equality threatening freedom in a democratic social state is nobody's minding the store, so to speak. We're all just engaged in our private activities. And Lincoln mentions that in his perpetuation speech when he says you've got this ambition on one hand, and the people who were united in their opposition to Britain during the Revolution, now they're peaceful and they're just pursuing their own private matters. The democratic social condition introduces a possible threat to political freedom. Political freedom, if it's going to be maintained, we have to get out of our shells, and we also have to respect the legitimacy of certain inequalities. Inequality of political power. All right, ultimately, it's going to have to be connected to education for consent. An issue that a recent Supreme Court decision has made prominent is, what about the status, the importance of the bureaucracy? What about, in particular, independent agencies, i.e. agencies whose chief administrators cannot be removed by the president? That's going to be challenged, especially in a new Trump administration. And what about civil service? I'm not sure how many Hudson Institute Political Studies participants and graduates want to go into government. Yeah, we have several million well-qualified people serving in government. How do we know they're well-qualified? Well, at least they have to pass a test. That's not election. That changed. When Tocqueville was observing America, it was the spoils system, it was called. No, we've got an active bureaucracy. So the issue of centralized government as a problem for the maintaining of freedom in a democratic social state, which Tocqueville identified, number one, we can see it today. So that's a justification for reading an old book. I think the first 4 weeks does a good job of introducing the question of regime in the political sense, regime in the individual sense, looking at America at the founding, and then looking at America under this distinctive challenge. And I don't think we have a comparable challenge today to the same degree or extent, but we can still be reminded that one shouldn't simply take political freedom for granted. This course of study does make us very much aware of that.
Right.
Now, do you want to talk more, or shall we say something about what the students do in this program? Or
Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Professor Dry. If you're interested in learning more from Professor Dry, please apply to Hudson Institute Political Studies or to Middlebury College, where he teaches. Thank you very much.